live a life worthy of the gospel. Right? We're not saved by obedience, but we are saved to obedience. Christ gives you His Spirit, who then enables you to live a life worthy of the gospel. Everybody with me? So we've not taken a hard left into legalism. Right? We're not talking about earning salvation. We're talking about living in light of it. Especially when we face hardship, difficulty, and persecution because of it. So that's the command. Only, right? So no matter what happens, no matter what opposition comes your way, no matter what happens to me even, Paul writes, no matter if I come and see you or I'm absent. That's the context, right? So whether I come and see you or whether I'm absent or no matter what opposition or whatever you face, only let your life be worthy of the gospel. All right, so what does that even mean? How do we do that? What is a life worthy of the gospel? What does that even look like? Well, we don't have to guess, right? Continue reading verse 27 with me. Only let your manner of life be worthy of the gospel of Christ, so that, whether I come and see you or am absent, I may hear of you that you are standing firm in one spirit, with one mind, striving side by side for the faith of the gospel, and not frightened in anything by your opponents. All right, so stop right there. What words, when you look at that, what words jump off the page? Some of them are repeated. You get one, right? One is repeated, one spirit, one mind, and then you get that striving side by side, right? So there's this idea of togetherness. Listen, what Paul is telling us here is that a gospel-worthy life is characterized primarily, first and foremost, by unity with other believers. A gospel-worthy life is characterized primarily by unity with other believers. Now, you may, if I just asked you what a gospel-worthy life looked like, you probably would not have told me unity. We always think individualistically. Personal righteousness, holiness, quiet time, evangelism. But what Paul says is none of that. No, those are good things. I'm not saying those are bad things. They are good things. But a gospel-worthy life is characterized primarily, especially in the face of opposition, by unity with other believers, particularly believers that you are in covenant fellowship with in a local church. Now, this includes the church unity. Well, we do want to have unity with other believers in other churches. Yes, and we want that. But Paul is writing to a church who is facing real persecution. And you want to live a gospel-worthy life in Philippi? Have unity with one another. Right? So this is one of the reasons that we believe in and push for covenant church membership. Like very practically, being a covenant member of our church lets everyone else know, and you know, who you are to have this kind of unity with. Right? Everybody with me on that? Yeah. All right. Now, this passage then defines unity for us. It's going to define unity for us and then give us two things that unity reveals to us and to our opponents. We haven't read those yet. Don't start looking ahead. We're going to get to it, right? But that's kind of the shape. We're going to look at those, and then we'll see from the first couple verses, 2 or 3 verses of chapter 2, some keys to maintaining that kind of unity in our church. All right, so verse 27 defines unity as, we're just reading from the text, standing firm in one spirit, with one mind, striving side by side for the faith of the gospel, and not frightened in anything by your opponents. All right, so to really understand this text, you got to understand that Paul is tapping into something in Philippi. He's tapping into a cultural mindset there, and they understand these analogies immediately. And so to understand that, you need to know a little bit of the history of Philippi. I'm going to give you a one-sentence history of Philippi. The city of Philippi was set up as a Roman military outpost. It was Camp Beauregard, right? It's Leesville, right? Right? So if you want to teach the people of Philippi something, you put it in military tactic terms. It was like if I went and did a devotional to a football team. I didn't play football, so I don't have, I have Madden strategy from playing Madden, right? So I would have to do some research to put some things in football terms for them, but they would hear it and understand it if I did that well, right? That's what Paul does. He's just speaking their language. He's talking to people familiar with the tactics of Roman warfare. And so he uses this example. The first one he says is standing firm in one spirit. That's a defensive posture. Standing firm in one spirit. Picture the Roman army out there on the battlefield. If you've seen Gladiator recently, I've always been told, hey, don't use rated R movies as sermon illustrations. Whoops. Here we are. Gladiator is a great movie. In that opening scene, remember, and if you haven't seen it, just picture this. You got the Roman army just standing out in this field. They've burned down all the trees. They've made a battlefield suitable for them. And they're standing there, gleaming armor, cut hairs, trimmed beards, and they're standing there. They got their big metal shields and their spears. They've got their arrows. They're all there. But the opening scene, they're just standing there, right? And what's coming? Right? The barbarians, the Gauls, and they're just running, hooping, hollering. They got war paint on. They've got wooden shields, right? And rusty swords, but they look fierce. And they're charged. They look dangerous. And they're just charging through the woods. And they're just, Roman army just standing there. Now, what a different movie if they start running and Romans are like, well, see you later. And they tuck tail and run. Well, they don't do that, do they? No, they stand firm. Why? Well, if you remember the opening speech, in their mind, they've already won. Right? They had this belief that they were invincible. No one else had defeated them. They had the confidence of being undefeated. And sure enough, they win the battle. They stand firm. They're the invincible Roman army. How much more should the church have this kind of confidence in the face of opposition? We have already won. Not in theory. Not just in confidence, like, oh, we're confident we might win. We're probably going to. No, Jesus has already won. So how much more should the church have confidence to stand firm in the face of opposition? That's what Paul's getting at. Not frightened in anything by your opponents. They're already defeated. Further, not only are we to stand firm, but we're also to strive side by side. We are to strive side by side. This is offensive. Right? So not only do we stand firm when enemies attack, but we also take the fight to them. We are. The Bible commands us to go to war with the powers and principalities, the demonic forces of this world. Now, our weapons aren't physical, right? Because our enemies are not flesh and blood. This is just Ephesians 6, by the way. Spiritual warfare. Right? We don't fight against flesh and blood. Even when flesh and blood, other people are the ones screaming at us, calling us bigots, saying we're old-fashioned and ignorant, trying to shut us down, whatever. Paul reminds us that our battle is not really with them. Our battle is spiritual in nature. And so our weapons, then, are spiritual in nature. Our weapons are the Word and worship and prayer, thanksgiving, righteousness, gospel proclamation. Right? This going on the offense, this is why we call out sinful ideologies and why we're not afraid to name prosperity gospel preachers. Right? Those aren't brothers, those are wolves. We don't pet them. Right? That's why we proclaim the gospel to the lost. We defend and advance. We must be unified in that action. Right? But what this text shows us is that it's not just action. And we know this to be true of any army or any team. We must not only be unified in action, we must also be unified in purpose. Right? We got to know what we're fighting for and why. So we stand firm in one Spirit. And notice that's lowercase spirit. He's not talking about the Holy Spirit, although the Holy Spirit does help us in this. And, he says, one Spirit, and with one mind, striving side by side for the faith of the gospel. Now, I'm just going to combine these two for us today, spirit and mind, to say that the idea here is to have unity. The church must know what it's fighting for and why. It's got to know its purpose. What is the church fighting for? We know we're fighting against spiritual forces, forces of darkness, Satan. But what are we fighting for? Well, again, we don't have to guess. The purpose is right here in verse 27. So that I may hear of you that you are standing firm in one spirit, and with one mind striving side by side for the faith of the gospel. That's an interesting way to put that, isn't it? The faith of the gospel. A lot of times we think about personal faith and then this gospel over here. What he means by the faith of the gospel is kind of when he tells Timothy, guard the good deposit that's entrusted to you. Right? He's talking about the body of knowledge that makes up good doctrine, that makes up the gospel. So we strive side by side, we defend and advance for the truth that we are given in the Bible. The church is unified around the faith of the gospel. We're to both defend and fight for the faith of the gospel. If the church is to stand against its opponents, it must have a rock-solid unity around the core principles of the faith. Now, all I have to do is say that, and I hope you're like, uh-oh. Because doesn't it seem like, especially the church in America, has compromised on the essentials and fights over, takes their stand over the non-essentials? Well, that's kind of goofy, isn't it? And maybe in community group, Greg, we can discuss more about what those essentials and non-essentials are. But I just say for now that the essentials are the clear teaching of the Word that are necessary for salvation and kingdom building. Those are the things that we need to have a rock-solid unity around. There's plenty of other things that are non-essentials that we can playfully argue about. Right? What the end times are going to look like. That's good. You get what I mean. Non-essentials. We can get our manly desire to fight and argue and, whatever, about those things. But we've got to be able to strive side by side for the core units of the faith. We saw that in John 17, right? As I read it, when Jesus prays for the church, he prays that we would be sanctified, that we would be made holy by the truth, and that we would be unified in the face of a world that hates us. So Jesus, in arguably his most important prayer, prays that we would have a unity based on the truth of his word. That our unity would be based on the faith of the gospel. Everybody with me on this so far? All right. Now, look back at verse 28. That's what Paul's doing here. Now, Paul tells us what this kind of unity reveals to us and to our opponents. If we can have this kind of unity in the face of opposition, we stand firm together, and we strive side by side for the faith of the gospel, that reveals something to our opponents, and it reveals something to us. Let's look at verse 28. This, right, so what is this? Unity. Right, that kind of unity. This kind of unity is a sign to them of their destruction. Right, let's just stop right there. So what Paul's saying is, when you have this kind of arm in arm, stand together, no matter what comes, unity in the face of opposition, when the police are kicking down your door, and you just stand there together, and nobody runs, right? This is a clear sign to them of their destruction. In other words, they see it and they say, uh-oh, they're together. Now this is a common principle. Like, we know this to be true. Like, if I said this in any other area, it's like, oh yeah, that makes sense. Right? I mean, this goes all the way back to Genesis. Remember the Tower of Babel? What does God say? He looks at it, he looks down, and he says, oh, look at them. They have one language, and they have one purpose. And if we let this continue, right, speaking with the Trinity up there, he's like, if we let this continue, nothing will be impossible for them. And so what does he do? He goes down and divides them by language, and then spreads them out. He destroys their unity. Any movie that you watch, where any team is facing any kind of struggle, what do they always say? No matter what, we've got to stay together. Right? We've got to stay together. And every plot line is, they don't stay together. Right? That's how movies work. Why? Because this is a universal truth that we all know is very common. If there is a unified front, that is not good for the opponents. In fact, we even have a military tactic, divide and conquer, right? Again. So when the church is unified, when we stand firm and strive together in the face of opposition, the enemies of the gospel realize they're in trouble. It is a sign to them of their destruction. Verse 28 continues, this is a clear sign to them of their destruction, but also a clear sign of your salvation, and that from God. So our unity is a sign to us and to everyone else that we are truly saved. How does that work? All right, look at verse 29. Again, I don't have to make this up. It's right here for us. For, that's